Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. Climate change is no longer something that's a distant thing happening in a faraway place. It's not a distant threat. Its impacts are being felt all around the world as extreme weather seems to be accelerating wherever you look. This itself has huge implications for the global economy. Insurance premiums are on the increase wherever you look in the world. There are jurisdictions where you can't even get insurance, let alone jurisdictions where huge amounts of assets and homes are simply not insured. The risk of climate-accelerated impact is on the rise. So as discussions around the concepts of ESG or sustainability or transitioning away from fossil fuels become more polarized, there's a term that's come to the fore and is becoming more mainstream, and that term is climate resilience. The idea is a shift in focus from purely trying to mitigate emissions increase to actually focus on what can be done to increase the resilience of the world in which we live, whether that's supply chains from manufacturing to agriculture or ensuring that buildings are built in different ways. Perhaps most importantly, it's a discussion that recognizes that nothing happens in isolation, that impacts in one part of the world have knock-on effects elsewhere. And for any of us to be truly resilient to the impacts of climate change, we all need to be at the same time. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Ashfaq Zaman, who is the Strategic Communications Advisor to the Aspire to Innovate, or a2i program, which is a multinational digital transformation initiative set up by the government of Bangladesh. He's also the founder of the Dhaka Forum. He helped to facilitate the public-private partnership between Bangladesh and Google that actually helped to roll out technology to protect against flooding. So welcome to the show, Ashfaq. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, what climate resilience really is, and why it matters.
Thank you, Felicia. Very nice to have me over here. My main work is basically trying to find suitable partners, like-minded partners, to advance the agenda that we have at this point of the time, basically focusing on two aspects. One is building digital public infrastructure within Bangladesh. So that's one of the priority, so that we can create a more smart nation, a more digitally advanced nation. And at the same time, also trying to focus on sustainability, where climate is a big part of it. Many of us, we think whenever we talk about sustainability, only the climate angle comes in our mind. But actually, that's not the case. Sustainability in itself is a big ecosystem. Commerce comes within sustainability. Environment comes within sustainability. And maybe in the near future, the planetary system probably might also be included within the sustainability framework that we have, as we are trying to be a multi-planet species with the aspirations of many tech giants, as you probably know. So my role predominantly is to connect with like-minded partners to find how we can create synergies, and at the same time also do a bit of tech transfer, as we mainly focus on innovation and digitization, and try to see whether frugal innovations from this part of the world, that is from the South Asia or from the global South, can be exported elsewhere. And at the same time, how we can take policies, advanced data, AI, and other innovations that can be implemented within our region as well, predominantly Bangladesh.
Fantastic. So what is your understanding of climate resilience?
So these are very big terms. So if I just have to explain very simply, it's all about trying to cope up better with the changes, with the after effects of the climate change. In a simple way, that's the way I see being climate resilient. Because over the years, that's what our generations have been doing. I mean, without the advent of technology, without any funding, you will see that human civilization, they actually progressed because they were resilient. Climate problems existed from the Ice Age. Not only human species, all animal species by their default, they have this within their DNA to actually evolve to actually be resilient. Particularly, I will actually say about Bangladesh, my home country. There's this idiom of saying that the famous idiom, weathering the storm. We actually weather the storm. I mean, historically, our ancestors, they actually weathered the storm. So being resilient is part of our DNA, not only in terms of climate, but we see it across every social fabric. You throw anything at us, we will overcome that. And so that is basically, in my understanding, the natural way, the frugal way of coping up with the problems of climate change is what I would like to understand climate resilience is all about.
So could you explain to me, what are the sorts of things that can be done to help build climate resilience? We'll get to the idea of frugal innovation later, because I think that's quite exciting. But what sort of interventions does climate resilience require?
So you asked about innovation. So for countries like us, like why innovation actually matters in the first place, because we have seen that all the global initiatives, the pledges, they have not really worked. I personally believe that aid is not the way forward, because for climate issues to be addressed and that itself to be sustainable, it has to be linked with commerce. It has to be self-sufficient. Aid is probably just, like a one-off solution. It probably will not actually sort of focus on the full thing or maybe solve the full thing. So the most important part over here is to actually find those solutions which actually will work in reality. And as we can see, that innovation is probably the only way forward. Because if you're only concentrating what has worked previously, we are not in a very good stage. If you see, we are still not really progressed well in terms of our stance and our targets that we actually wanted to achieve, let it be from the COP summit or the policies. So innovation, not only in terms of technology, but I think innovation in approach and the mindset and how we can actually tackle this needs to be philosophically, this has to be addressed, and strategically it has to be addressed. If you allow, I'll just share a few ideas about how this should be addressed, the innovation in terms of our thought process. I think I already shared one aspect is that the whole pledging, the whole way that, the world leaders are pledging for solving this problem, it's not working. We know of it for sure. I mean, only 20% of the $100 billion that has been pledged was actually, kept up with the promise. Because fundamentally, the problem is that any promises without penalty will actually be penniless and will not solve the pain. So I think the main focus is that we need to design in such a way that there has to be some sort of penalty of not mitigating or not fulfilling the promise. It could be in the form of taxation. It could be in the form of sanctions. So the whole process of how we are designing the framework, that itself, the thought process itself needs innovation. I mentioned about moving away from aid. There has to be sustainable economic way. It's a capitalist society at the end of the day. I mean, the whole world is more or less moving towards that. So we need to make sustainability profitable to ensure the economics is very, very clear. So much so that what are the unit metrics? What are the rate of return if we actually make a mangrove forest? For every dollar that we spend, we are getting a 10x result. We have never really monetized that. We have never really put that into a country's balance sheet. We have never really seen what are the savings. So I think it's time to not only address the vulnerabilities, but also to see that how much we can actually save, on how much we can make profit or capitalize when we are actually addressing the climate issues.
Now, can I interrupt you there? Because this is a really, really important point as far as I'm concerned, which is this idea that we talk about the amount of money that can be leveraged. We talk about investment, the 100 billion, whatever the issues coming through the COP process. The World Bank has talked about the fact that when it invests $1, it can leverage $8 to $10 of further investment by de-risking whatever that investment is. When you're talking about the impact of a mangrove, I don't know what to call it, plantation, you talk about the fact that, it's 10 times the benefit. How are those benefits broken down? There's obviously the current system of valuation, on the financial side doesn't really encompass how that works. I've looked at the triple dividend of resilience, which, is a very interesting idea around avoided losses and, economic benefit and social and environmental benefit. But what do you mean by monetize, and what are the sort of returns that you're talking about?
So it depends on what field or what sector are we actually planning to focus. But if I give you one good example, because if you see for the whole world, how they're prioritizing, the best way to see is the big investment or organization in the whole world. So, for example, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, they mentioned just last year that the next big investment wave will be climate solution. Now, when they say it, it means that there are actually potential over here because they actually control or they are heavily invested in the stocks of all over the world. So how do we monetize? We basically can do that in three ways. The first is basically, and that was actually my third point, bringing in technological solution as products, which can not only benefit climate innovation or climate change, but at the same time can also be businesses of its own. So, for example, there's a very innovative company called Green Hydrogen. I'm not sure if you have heard about them. So, very nice technology which can be appointed by countries all over the world, by corporations, by different segments. You know, the AI industry is a very big industry now, and the GPUs, they create a lot of electricity. Now, there are new industries going on how they can actually mitigate this energy consumption. And that itself is also an industry. That itself has a lot of economy over there. So this is one side of it, where technology, where innovation, where solutions are provided. And that itself is a business model of its own. But the end product is that they are creating solutions. Just like any startup, they try to address a problem. But by addressing a problem, they're also creating funds. They're also creating finance. They're also creating profit for them. Let it be Uber or let it be any big startup. The second way is basically for the governments to understand that how much they're losing out in terms of not mitigating climate change properly or the after effects of climate change in that essence. So for a country like Bangladesh, for the last 40 years, we have lost 12 billion US dollars. 12 billion US dollars. If you could save that, we shouldn't be actually trying to get a loan from IMF at this point of the time, which is probably around $4 to $5 billion. It's as simple as that. So it's the way in accounting that we do depreciation, right? We should also try and do environmental depreciation for us as well. For lack of better terms, I'm trying to use this word to understand that how we can ensure that if we have a more sustainable environment, how much we can actually save, because saving itself is a big part of the economy. The third and the final is basically for a long-term benefits when we are actually talking about green energy. We all know about this. These has been already been discussed in many places that if you move from coal-based plant to a windmill plant or a clean energy, what are the return in long terms? We all know about that. So I think that transition needs to be made. And I think in that particular segment, we did make some progress globally as well.
Excellent. Perhaps you could talk me through this idea of frugal innovation. Because as I say, I'm really interested in this idea of how you can encourage both the public and the private sector to invest in resilience, because there are ways of looking at how you can generate profit. But at the same time, a number of adaptation projects, for example, are quite capital intensive to begin with, and you get payback over a longer period of time. How do you do that frugally if you don't have the capital up front?
I think for the global south and for countries like Bangladesh, solutions are actually the only way, because, we have waited long for the expectation of funds. Omission of funds means emissions in the air. That's the way I see it. So frugal solution is actually the only way forward, or frugal innovation in that sense. I'll probably give you 3 or 4 examples of what we are doing in Bangladesh. And of course, there are many other countries who are also coming up with their own frugal innovation. I think one of the essence of frugal innovation is that it has to be homegrown. What will work in this part of the world may not necessarily work elsewhere, because climate itself is very customized. The cyclones over here will not be the same cyclones maybe in Florida. So we need customer solutions. One thing that historically that has happened in Bangladesh is that in many rural areas, they have actually done floating harvesting. So what they actually do is basically floating garments, where they actually raise the crops within the water. So they use the bamboo framework, and they basically are harvesting and growing their food within the a bit watery area or flooded area, or where there's high water level. Similarly, when we have high salinity areas, people are developing indigenous crops which can sustain high salinity levels as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and these are not done by billion-dollar research. These are done by our farmers by only trial and error. So it's permutation combination, and they saw that, well, this works. If we add a bit more urea fertilizer over here, that works. If we increase the nitrogen level, maybe that works. So it's all about permutation and combination, and they have figured out that way. And those areas where we couldn't expect agriculture are actually producing not only their own, but they are producing enough that can be exported globally now. We have in our Northeast region where we have this issue, and they are now producing enough vegetables, enough food, which now can be exported in the Western countries as well. So that is a classic example of frugal innovation. I'll give you another one quickly, is that all across Bangladesh, in all the 64 districts, you will find school establishments. They're built in such a way that they can also act as cyclone centers. So they are elevated, which means that during flood, during cyclone, they can actually work as cyclone centers. So these are frugal innovations from our end.
So it's basically, it's learning what's possible and transforming the way in which you do things to fit a changing environment, and at the same time ensuring that what you develop and deploy is multi-purpose.
Absolutely. And we just have to, once we have done it, once we have seen the success, I think the most important part is to basically replicate it elsewhere. Because most of the time, these are homegrown solution. Maybe it's been identified in one part of the village. But if the government or the state can patronize that and they can take the learning and sort of replicate in all the other areas, then it becomes part of your national policy. And you truly get the benefit in tenfolds.
Yeah, and do you think that is how we make climate finance more efficient? Because one of the challenges, there have been so many battles over the amounts of climate finance. You know, in the original Kyoto Protocol, the idea was common but differentiated responsibilities, and that, Annex 1 countries should be providing finance. And then there were all the arguments. Well, is it public finance? Is it private finance? How much should it be? And then Fast Start finance was repurposed overseas development aid, and it got incredibly complicated and confusing. And then, of course, there was the agreement under Paris to provide 100 billion, which took, I think, until this year, possibly last year, to actually be deployed. And then, of course, the recent COP in Azerbaijan, where I think the final sum agreed, while it was more than was originally on the table, is a drop in the bucket to the 1 trillion that the Global South has said it needs in order to address climate change. So what do we do?
Yeah, before I address your particular question, I think the way we are seeing things, I think needs a little bit of redefinition. We probably need to have a fresh look on this thing. You see, 78% of this pollution is actually done by the Western world, if I may be very blunt about it, or the developed economies. And we are the ones who are suffering in the Global South or the developing economies. And the whole debate is about climate finance. I think the debate should be about climate justice because it's not justified. We are dealing with problems. Like, again, Bangladesh has been dealing with a problem of almost $12 billion, 1.3 million people displaced, where we probably had 0.3% contribution to the overall problem. That is injustice, plain and simple. I mean, if you put it in a law perspective, that's injustice. So I think climate finance should not be the main focus. I think climate justice should be the same focus. And if you put that into perspective, a lot of things could be. Again, we always talk about saving the planet, but essentially, if you really break it down, it's actually about saving human. I mean, that's the core matter of things. If my economy is dying, if my people are dying, that's basically what really is the main essence of it. We can make it fancy by using many fancy terms, but at the end of the day, it's the humans who are getting affected. You see the pollution in Lahore, the pollution in Delhi, the pollution in Dhaka. It's difficult for our children to breathe at this point of the time. We do have some contribution, but not the most of it.
No, and I think that's well understood by who really understand what's going on in the climate sphere. But the reality is that a lot of people don't understand it. And that, if I'm going to be brutal about it, what you've seen politically in the global north is governments are not being politically penalized for not stepping up and taking action. So while I may agree with you, it's an issue of climate justice, that doesn't change what is being agreed to or what is going on. So one of the questions, and I think one of my interests in the concept of climate resilience, is how you can turn the reality of the need for climate justice into something that can be understood politically in the economies of the global north. And for me, that seems to be the connections between different economies, so that when there are problems in a place like Bangladesh, honestly, I hate to say it, but part of the way a lot of humans behave is if it doesn't affect them, they don't think about it. So how does that connection work? And do you think that is a useful way of leveraging change?
I think first and foremost, in the global seats, in the global forum, let it be the COP summit or any other forum, I think those countries who are suffering the most needs the bigger seat. Only then the policies, because we are the sufferers. We know the solution firsthand, and we know the problems firsthand as well. Often this is not actually the case. It's being run by the global leaders who are part of the problem, who are not necessarily facing the main problem. If you're not in the table, you are part of the menu. So we are becoming part of the menu. So we basically need a bigger seat. We basically, because the global south, if you see very closely, we have the will, but we don't have the wealth. The West or the developed economy probably has the wealth, but not necessarily the will, as we can probably see. And there needs to be a balance between these two elements. When the global south takes into leadership position and they run this, the strategic apex, the frameworks, the practicality of it, I think eventually there will be a time when they will be talking about enforcements. They will be talking about consequences. They will be talking about penalties.
This is what I wanted to sort of get to, because while it makes a lot of sense on one level that those most at risk from climate change should have the largest voice about how to deal with it, the reality is the current treaties don't have an enforcement mechanism.
Exactly.
Have to get agreement from everybody to move forward. And until you can find a way to make the economies of the global south, and bluntly that means the voters, understand the consequences of inaction, there will not be a political penalty. And without a political penalty, it's unlikely that those governments who are trying to deal with geopolitical tension and inflation and their own domestic concerns, if they're going to prioritize climate action, how do we make that connection? How do we show that the resilience of economies like Bangladesh and, other economies in the global south is necessary for the resilience of economies in the global north?
I think first and foremost, the global south needs to be unified about it. I think we are all fighting in our own way. Like Bangladesh probably is only focused about the problems in Bangladesh. Climate don't really work in that way. It works in a macro segment, right? What's happening in Philippines will affect us eventually. What's happening in Nepal and the sedimentation, the Himalayas, will eventually affect us. So I think the global south needs a more unified voice. We have global platforms like the UN where we can demand for a resolution, which then can be ratified by most of the nations. See a very unified and serious approach by the global south on this agenda. Even the global south, so I probably will be taking it one step forward and saying that we should be creating our own platform. Like, for example, you have the OIC for the Muslim countries, or the Middle East countries. There could be a global south forum for climate, and they should be advocating, they should be putting political pressure, they should be utilizing their diaspora. One thing the global south has, they have a big diaspora, which can create a significant impact in the political economy or the political situation of the Western nation in England, in USA, as we have seen in the recent elections as well. So it has to be a well-planned, well-strategized effort, unified effort. And we probably have to, again, I'll refer back to the first thing that I was saying, that we need an innovative, a different outlook. I think the main outlook has been always by the global south is in trying to anticipate and wait for the advanced economies to help and support us. We know it's not coming. We know it's false promises. It's time to realize that and take actions from our own end. If you do that, that'll be step one. I'll probably add another idea that I have over here, and I've written some op-eds on this as well, is that big tech, if you see the size, the economic size of the big tech, they're probably bigger than a few GDPs combined of few developing nations. GDP of Google, probably 14 or 15 nations combined has less GDPs than Google. Now, they also have some moral obligation. Many a times, founders, they usually, the CEOs or the top management, they usually are problem solvers. And we also need to actually engage them in try and see how they can help in mitigating the problem. They have the fund. Obviously, they have the technological skills. They have the expertise. And I feel if we can put enough pressure on them, they probably may have the right will as well.
You mentioned the recent election in the US, and we're talking about leadership and how that might change things. What do you think the impact of a Trump-led government is going to have on the overall climate conversation?
To be honest with you, I've got a rather controversial viewpoint on that. I think it's going to be better because you see, when we are dreaming about something which is not a reality, it's going to bite us at one point, and then it's going to bite us really bad. But I think it's best when when we diagnose the problem. Not understanding that we have a cancer is a bigger problem than actually having the cancer. If you identify it in the right stage, we can then actually create proper solution to address that. With the Trump administration, one thing is very clear, that all the pledges and the commitments that has been made in the Paris Accord and other places, the US will pull out from that. He has been very clear in a declaration and his viewpoints towards that. So I think we now know where we are. And I think this is probably best for us to understand, not to really live in this utopia that things will work out. We know the problem. We know who are there, who supports us, who are there, who's not supporting us. And this will play into better advantage. The only difference and the only key thing over here is to see whether we now take things in our own hands, whether we now not only depend on these global leaders who are not really doing much, but create solutions from our own end.
I think that's a fascinating idea, because I think to a certain extent, there is an assumption that it's such a big problem that only governments can really address it. And yet we know that if you can scale up 100 million little actions, it can make a really big difference. So perhaps the idea that as individuals and as individual nations, we can start actually pushing forward on our own is a really interesting take on the whole issue. I suppose I'm really left with my final question, which is, what haven't I asked you about that I should have done?
I think we were talking about innovation. So that's also my field of interest. And I feel that if you see what's happening currently, all the big problems of the world is actually being solved through technological advancement. Let it be, problems in the healthcare, let it be problems in finance. So I think we also need to address how technology can enable us to tackle global warming. Although technology is many a times the main culprit, because producing the technology itself is requiring a lot of energy
and a lot of other resources. There's been a lot of talk recently about critical minerals, because I think China's put an embargo on some of them, on the export of some of them. And one of the questions I always have is, are we waiting for technological solutions to the detriment of non-technological actions? Because they're not as easy to define, to value, to quantify return. But is technology alone going to be enough?
Brilliant question. I think it has to be a combination. It has to be a combination therapy. So we need the frugal innovation. That's the reason why it's very important, because it does not require a lot of funds. It's mostly indigenous. It's in our DNA. That's how we survived for so long. Those elements probably needs a little bit of more study, a little bit of more advanced level research on how we can optimize that. The floating in Bangladesh, if Harvard University or Cambridge University is researching on it, they might find solutions which can probably optimize that by another 20 to 30%. And that way, the impact we probably will have is equivalent of having maybe a $20 or $30 million grant. So that is one way. But I also believe that simultaneously, we also have to focus on tech as well. Because what tech can do is it can accelerate, it can actually create very fast and effective solution. If you see like the COVID situation, what took us 10 years for a vaccine to be produced, we can do that in 1 year. And of course, there comes some liabilities, some aftermaths or after effects of it. But the fact that we could contain it in such a short period of time is because of technology. So the speed of technology, I'm very optimistic about it. What is important is basically the will the intent behind it. If the big tech have the right intention, I think they can create solutions, technological solutions, which, even a coal plant can be producing a net carbon zero emissions. We never know. I mean, we have seen rocket going up and coming down, coming back. So you never know. We can be harvesting energy in some other nation, other planets as well. So it all depends on the intent. If they have the intent, they have the fund, I think that can accelerate, because we need a little bit of acceleration on that. I feel that frugal innovation is important, but the way global warming is taking precedence, I think we need a little bit fast.
I mean, there's an incredibly critical need for rapid action. And in many ways, I suppose that's where my focus on the financial aspect comes from. Because if you can persuade money to change its mind and change where it invests, then you change the trajectory of emissions, of the economy, of the way in which we live. Right. I think what's fascinating is the analogy you used to COVID, because one of the phrases I heard, one of the discussions I heard was this idea that the thing about COVID was it happened to everyone at once. It was immediate. You knew people. Right. Whereas with climate change, it's historically been something that happens elsewhere, or it's a risk multiplier. It makes worse the things that were already going to happen. So how do you say this thing was caused by climate? So there seems to be so many arguments and debates, and it's making that connection between what happens in Bangladesh and perhaps what happens in the UK that will change the way in which we think about the climate challenge.
Oh, indeed. I think we're not far away from that place where the whole world will be realizing this today or tomorrow. As I mentioned, that is the way the nature works. But we don't want to go over there. We don't want to be in a stage where we have already lost enough, where we have suffered enough. So I think, yes, advocacy and the right information, the right impact analysis, the right knowledge propagation needs to be the right literacy when it comes to the climate literacy needs to be there. And again, we need probably have to go back to technology, because the social media is so important. They can change the results of election. They're so powerful, right? So creating public perception is very important. We have so much of misinformation. We have so much of confusion. And I think we were discussing about the myths as well that has been circulating within this, within the topics of climate change. I think these needs to be addressed properly. The more people can understand and more strategic campaigns that the people, the global south in particular, can actually devise and design, it will be better. You see how, because the whole internet, the whole social media works on hype. The problem regarding, the Black Lives Matter existed for a long period of time. But it's actually the social media campaign which has really brought that into one, right? So same goes with the Me Too movement. I think it's time that there is a strong, orchestrated, and well strategized plan on creating, proper knowledge when it comes to climate change as well.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And a perfect note on which to end this conversation. Ashfaq, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed listening to you and learning more about what you're doing. To our listeners, thanks once again for joining us. I hope you found today interesting. And if anyone's got any grand ideas for a global climate literacy campaign, get in touch. Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.